The Role of Government, Chapter 4, Part 3. Everybody's favorite topic, taxation. Taxes pay for government spending. There's a change in the output mix as more government spending absorbs factors of production that could be used to produce consumer goods. The opportunity cost of taxation is measured by the private sector output sacrificed when government employs scarce factors of production. So what does that mean? The opportunity cost of taxation is what you would have spent the money on if you didn't have to pay taxes. So if I would have spent the money on a new Ford pickup, if I didn't have to pay taxes, and Ford pays that opportunity cost because they don't get that money. Their workers don't get raises as they may have if everyone had spent the money they would have normally paid in taxes on a Ford. They don't produce as many cars as if there was no taxation or less taxation. And by producing less, they're providing their workers less, they're providing less jobs, they're creating less innovation. So there's an economic hit. And then those workers that would be working at Ford if there was no taxation that are currently unemployed, those workers, if they had worked at Ford, would be producing more, spending more in their own lives because they'd have a better job. So we're sacrificing their spending as well. So there's a real deep opportunity cost when we tax. Many people believe that if we didn't tax for redistribution, those that are receiving redistributed income right now would actually receive more with no tax in the form of jobs and an improved economy, and they would have better jobs open to them and ultimately have a higher standard of living without the redistribution. The primary function of taxes is to transfer command over resources, purchasing power from the private sector to the public sector. Once again, transferring the power to spend from private to public. Income taxes, the largest single source of government revenue. We have a progressive tax system. As your income increases, your tax rate also rises. We already talked about that. Compared to those with lower incomes, those with higher incomes pay more taxes and pay a greater fraction of their income in taxes. So not only do you pay more, but you pay a higher percentage as well. Social Security tax. This is a regressive tax system. As income rises, the tax rate falls. Compared to those with lower incomes, those with higher incomes pay more taxes but pay a smaller fraction of their income in taxes. Because Social Security taxes stop at a certain threshold. So if you make $200,000 a year, I believe it's only the first 90-something thousand you have to pay Social Security tax on. So those who make a lot of money pay a smaller percentage of their incomes into Social Security. Other taxes, you have corporate taxes. These are usually passed on to the customer in the form of higher prices. It's a progressive tax system to the corporation, meaning the more they make, the more they pay. Excise taxes, these are imposed on a specific good or service. Some are imposed that discourage production and consumption of these goods. These are also referred to as sin taxes at times. So you may get an excise tax on tobacco because the government's trying to keep you from using tobacco. You also will find excise taxes on gasoline because the government wants us to use less gasoline because they want to keep gasoline prices down and they want the demand to be down to keep prices down. And if the price of gas is down, politicians feel that they will have a better chance of getting elected. So they want to tax it heavier, keep demand down, and once again, keep everybody happier. Hasn't worked thus far. Other taxes, you have property tax. This is a major source of local tax revenue. Most of you, if you own a home, will pay property tax. All of you, I'm sure. It's a regressive tax. Poor people are hurt much more by property taxes. Rich people aren't hurt by property taxes. They're very small for someone who has a lot of money. Sales tax, another major source of local revenue, also a regressive tax. The percentage of the income of a poor person is much higher when they pay sales tax than a rich person. A rich person, sales tax means nothing to them. It's a drop in the bucket. But to a poor person, that 10%, 8% in sales tax actually really hurts. So let's look at tax rates throughout our history. we look at the top marginal tax rate on individuals. Starting in 1930, we were in the low 20s, and it jumped up with FDR to above 60. By the time FDR was, by the time he was out of office, and Truman, who took over when he died, but kept up his policies, the top marginal tax rate was in the mid 90s. So those who made a lot of money paid over 90% of their income to taxes. So that's the Democrats, when they were in office, once again took it from the 20s to over 100%. When Eisenhower, a Republican, came in, I should say that taxes went down a little in the late 40s, but still over 80%. Eisenhower kept them high. So it's not just a matter of Democrats raising them and Republicans dropping them. Eisenhower kept them high. Kennedy kept them high as well. They dropped a little bit under LBJ, but still Lyndon Johnson, still in the 70s. And they popped up a little under Nixon. So once again, a Republican put them up a little bit. And stayed high in the over 70% under Ford and Carter. And then Reagan dropped them in a series of moves from over 70% to the high 20s. Massive drop in taxes. They were raised again under Bush, Bush first, and Clinton again in the early 90s. They stayed stable for a while until the Bush tax cuts after 9/11. And you see the line has stayed stable since the Bush tax cuts. This graph hasn't been updated since a few months ago. Obama raised the taxes again. So we're right about that 40% mark again right now. So we're lower than we've been throughout our history, but for most of our history with income tax rates. But it's still higher than it's been in recent years. And then you also look at the total federal revenue as a percentage of GDP. And you can see how stable that is. That we're right around 19% for the most part. So no matter what our rate is, but when you look at the percentage of GDP, you can see that the total amount of the percentage of GDP stays very stable throughout. So when we compare the different tax rates, our income taxes are light blue, the corporate tax is the red, the social insurance tax, this is your Medicare and Social Security, and other miscellaneous taxes down below. You can see our corporate taxes have steadily gone down in terms of what people actually pay. This isn't a matter of the tax rates, but this is what people actually end up paying. You can see our corporate taxes have steadily decreased because people realize that if you charge business less taxes, they hire more, which keeps unemployment down. They can sell at lower prices, which keeps the economy moving. And the income you generate from corporate taxes is really pretty low anyway. You can see personal income taxes, the amount people actually pay, kind of jumps around, but still stays pretty much between 6 and 8%. And social insurance has steadily gone up since the 60s when it first started. Government failure. Government intervention should move the mix of output closer to society's desired mix. When the government fails to improve economic outcomes, and in fact, they may worsen economic outcomes. Much of what we've seen since the Great Recession in 2008, we've seen government failure, where the government, despite massive action, has failed to improve economic outcomes. When you look at unemployment, our unemployment rate is still way above where it was prior to the Great Recession. And it's also, we have millions and millions of more people who aren't even trying for jobs that are not included in the unemployment rate. We'll talk about that in another chapter. We've also had very minimal GDP growth, and all of our GDP growth has come from printing more money. And we have falsely very low interest rates. They should not be as low as they are. The government is keeping them low. All signs of government failure to create an improved economic situation. The same thing happened at the end of or during the Great Depression under FDR. He tried everything, and during his radio addresses he would say, we'll try one thing after another, and if something fails we'll try something else. Well, he did, and he never fixed the Great Depression. World War II got us out of the Great Depression. He tried everything for the government to pull us out of the Great Recession. He just ended up making it worse for the most part. Perceptions of waste. The public perception is the government isn't producing as many services as it could within the resources at its disposal. This inefficiency pushes the economy inside the production possibilities curve. A related question is, are we giving up too many private sector goods in order to get those services? Is the opportunity cost of all these taxes, of all this redistribution, too high? Are we giving up too much real economic growth for government-created growth, which doesn't seem to stick around? The stimulus is a perfect example. The economic stimulus of 2009. We invested massive amounts of money in the stimulus, both in terms of tax cuts and input into the economy, and there was no measurable improvement in the economy. In fact, the economy kept getting worse afterwards. Well, what was the opportunity cost of all that spending? How much better off would we have been if we had kept the money in the hands of the people, if we kept the government out of things and let the market run its course? We'll never know which would be better. We don't know if the market would have done better, but we know that the stimulus, the government intervention, did not help. Valuation of costs and benefits. Additional public sector activity is desirable only if the benefits from activity exceed its opportunity costs. So we only want the government to step in, and ideally, if they are going to help us more than the opportunity cost that we are giving up, more than the economic activity that would have happened with the money that they have taken from us in taxes. How do we know if this happens? Whose values should be used to determine this? How do we identify the benefits? How do we know what the opportunity costs are? People try to model these things, but it's pretty much impossible. We don't know. But what we do know is that when government steps in and takes an extremely active role in the economy, traditionally it has not resulted in economic growth. Only in times economic growth only happens with massive government intervention when there is an unforeseen third variable that comes in. Perfect example, the Great Depression. The government was massively involved in the economy for 8 years under FDR. And then in 1941, of course, Pearl Harbor happens. It was more like 8.5 years. Pearl Harbor happens. We get into World War II, and this unforeseen third factor comes in and changes the economy. Well, it wasn't government interaction that changed the economy. It was World War II. Under the Clinton administration, we had the tech boom that created massive amounts of unforeseen tax revenue and a big boost to the economy when the internet really changed the world, changed our economy. Well, was it the government intervention that changed the economy for the better? I mean, Clinton loves to take credit for all that. We'll talk about Clinton later in terms of his tax policies and how much of what he did actually did help a little bit. But if not for the tech boom, he would not be able to claim all this economic success when in fact he had nothing to do with the tech boom. Public choice theory. A theory of public sector behavior emphasizing rational self-interest of decision makers and voters. Government decision makers are supposed to serve the people. However, many set their own agenda and give higher priority to personal advancement than public welfare. Bureaucrats are just as selfish as everyone else. So the selfish behavior of bureaucrats, the desire for them to get reelected, the desire for them to cater to special needs and to cater to people who gave them money for their campaigns, often dictates their decision making. And in that case, the government is not acting in the best interest of the people. The government is acting in the best interest of the politicians, the bureaucrats. And this is one of the fatal flaws of large government interaction, is the basic sinful nature of human beings. The fall of man really has more to do than anything with the fact that politicians are corrupted by power, corrupted by money, and they make decisions that are not in the best interest of the country. Public choice benefit cost analysis. In the private sector, benefits and costs usually accrue to the same person, and it makes it easy to compare the two and make a decision as to which is better. In government, the benefits and costs accrue to different people. So they take money from one group and give it to another, so the benefit is given to a person different from the person who pays for it. That's different than the private sector. It makes it very difficult to determine what's good and what's bad and what's working and what isn't. What does society want produced? Can either the market-based or state-run system or a combination of the two produce the mix of output desired by society in general? A pure market system will not produce adequate quantities of some goods. A market economy will not produce enough vaccine for diseases. It's not profitable. They won't do it. But a pure government system cannot determine the mix of output desired by buyers and sellers. No matter how hard a government tries, we know for a fact, and through numerous examples of heavy government interaction, that they cannot determine supply and demand. They cannot force it. And governments and economies fail when the government takes over the economic side of a country. By trial and error, a combination of the two systems is typically considered best, but what type of combination is extremely difficult to determine and probably changes on an hourly basis.